The classroom was filled with chatter as the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Most students gathered their books with the usual teenage apathy, but one remained seated at the back, his eyes locked on the assignment in front of him. Javier had just aced another practice exam, scoring higher than anyone else in class. He had worked for it, late nights, no weekends, juggling part-time jobs and caring for his younger siblings. But when he finally mustered the courage to tell his teacher he wanted to apply to Harvard, the man laughed. Loudly, publicly. You? Harvard? Let's try community college first. Okay? The words echoed louder than the bell ever could. What Mr. Lawson didn't know was that Javier had already received a letter. It was still sealed in his backpack, waiting for the perfect moment. The full ride. Harvard. Ivy League. And now, the question wasn't whether Javier could make it. It was whether the world was ready for a kid like him to prove it wrong. Javier always sat in the back corner of room 214, not because he was trying to hide, but because it gave him the clearest view of everything. From that spot he could watch the clock, the whiteboard, the teacher's expressions, and most importantly, the way students reacted when something finally clicked or when they gave up completely. He'd learned more from observing than most people learned from lectures. The desk in front of him bore etchings from a decade of restless teenagers. He never added to them. While others doodled or texted beneath their desks, Javier took notes with an almost surgical precision. He didn't have the luxury of coasting through school. Every mark, every exam, every paper meant something more. It meant proximity to a future he had to carve out of thin air. His days started before sunrise. He would wake quietly, careful not to disturb his mother, who had only just returned from her night shift at the hospital. After getting his younger siblings dressed and fed, he walked them to school, then sprinted the remaining 10 blocks to make it to his first period on time. His backpack was always heavier than it needed to be, filled with textbooks, SAT prep guides he'd borrowed from the public library, and a spiral-bound notebook where he wrote down every goal, deadline, and quote that ever motivated him to push harder. He didn't do it for attention. In fact, he preferred to stay unnoticed. When people didn't expect much from you, it was easier to surprise them. Javier's grades were impeccable, but they came at a cost. While his classmates went out on weekends or scrolled endlessly through their phones, he spent his nights tutoring online, writing essays in the corner of the kitchen while his siblings slept, and solving advanced math problems by candlelight during blackouts. He never complained. Every struggle was a reminder that he was working towards something bigger, something that could change his family's trajectory forever. But even with his dedication and natural aptitude, he knew that people like him weren't supposed to dream too big. The system had a way of reminding you of your place. His AP English teacher, Mr. Lawson, was a man who had taught for nearly 20 years and had long since stopped expecting greatness. He had a sarcastic edge, the kind that could either be endearing or quietly venomous depending on who was on the receiving end. Javier didn't dislike him, but he knew the man had already made up his mind about which students were worth investing in. Javier wasn't one of them. The subtle signals were always there. Less feedback on essays, fewer follow-up questions in class, occasional looks of surprise when Javier's name appeared at the top of the score list. Mr. Lawson never said it directly, but Javier could feel it in every interaction. You're smart, but not that kind of smart. Still, Javier kept pushing. He had spent months preparing for college applications, crafting personal statements late into the night, researching scholarships, and emailing counselors he'd never met in person. He had submitted applications to several universities, but one mattered more than the rest. Harvard. It was a long shot, he knew that. The acceptance rate was brutally low. But he also knew that sometimes life demanded you take a chance just to prove you could. He didn't tell anyone except his mother. Not his classmates, not his siblings, and certainly not Mr. Lawson. On the day the early decisions were set to be released, Javier felt a knot in his stomach. The email had arrived that morning, but he hadn't opened it yet. He needed time, space, focus. He carried his backpack to school like it was filled with fire, the weight of possibility pressing into his spine with every step. The school day unfolded as usual. Mundane lectures, hallway noise, locker slams, announcements over the intercom that no one listened to. But in his chest, Javier felt everything happening in slow motion. When he entered English class, he was greeted by the usual buzz of conversation and chairs scraping against the tile. He took his seat in the back, opened his notebook, and stared at the blank page while Mr. Lawson handed back graded essays. Javier's was marked with an A-, with a single sentence of commentary: good structure, but lacks emotional depth. He read it twice, then closed the folder. It didn't matter. Not today. As class wound down, Javier lingered after the bell rang. He approached Mr. Lawson's desk cautiously. He wasn't seeking approval, just honesty. He told him, in as neutral a tone as he could, that he had applied to Harvard. It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact. But the look on Mr. Lawson's face shifted immediately. His brows lifted, not in encouragement, but in disbelief. Then came the chuckle. Light at first, then louder. Mr. Lawson shook his head and leaned back in his chair, as if Javier had just announced he wanted to be an astronaut next week. He said something casual but cutting, something about setting realistic expectations and not setting yourself up for disappointment. He mentioned how Ivy Leagues were competitive, how they looked for a certain kind of student, and how community college might be a better fit to start with. It wasn't said with cruelty, it was worse. It was said with confidence, as though he was doing Javier a favor, as though the teacher believed sincerely that this advice would protect him. Javier didn't respond. He nodded once, gathered his things, and walked out without another word. He didn't feel angry, not yet. What he felt was confirmation, not of failure but of everything he had always known. That the world didn't expect someone like him to be extraordinary. That effort was fine, but aspiration was a step too far. When he sat beneath the tree outside the school that afternoon, he finally pulled out his phone. The email was still there. His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped it open. There it was, the word congratulations, glowing at the top of the message. He had been accepted. Full scholarship. Harvard. He read it 3 times to make sure it was real. His heart pounded. He didn't cry. He didn't cheer. He just sat there, the winter sun warming his face, letting the silence hold him steady. They would all know soon enough. But not today. Today, this moment was his. The following week unfolded like any other, at least on the surface. Javier walked the same cracked sidewalks to school, carried the same heavy backpack, sat in the same back row seat of every classroom. Nothing in his routine had changed, but internally, everything had shifted. He still hadn't told anyone about the acceptance letter. It wasn't because he doubted its reality. He had read it enough times to memorize every word, but because he was waiting for the right moment, a moment when the truth could speak for itself. For now, he carried it with him quietly, like a flame in his chest, both delicate and unbreakable. In the days that followed, Mr. Lawson continued treating him with the same tone of casual dismissal. In class, Javier noticed how the teacher directed the more challenging questions toward a handful of favored students, rarely toward him despite his consistent performance. He watched the way Mr. Lawson complimented others for answers Javier had known before the question was even finished. And yet, Javier didn't raise his hand to prove anything. He didn't argue, didn't challenge. He was no longer looking for permission to be excellent. At home, his mother began noticing small differences. Javier moved with more purpose. He studied, yes, but he also took longer walks, stared longer at the ceiling before bed, smiled more when he thought no one was watching. His siblings, too young to understand what a Harvard scholarship meant, sensed a kind of victory in the air, like something long hoped for had quietly arrived. Still, Javier said little. He helped with chores, kept his grades up, and waited. The school was hosting its annual college prep assembly, a half-hearted affair held in the auditorium where representatives from local community colleges, trade programs, and a few state schools handed out brochures and made PowerPoint presentations. The administration claimed it was about creating opportunity, but for many of the students, it felt more like a reality check. Javier sat through the speeches with polite attention, aware of the subtle messages in every slide. Know your limits. Choose safe options. Don't aim too high unless you have the right background, the right resources, the right name. After the presentations, Mr. Lawson gathered a few students in the hallway to talk about college applications. He singled out one of the athletes with decent grades, encouraging him to look into UCLA, and telling another student she had a strong shot at Berkeley if she kept her GPA solid. Javier stood nearby, listening without being addressed. Then, as if remembering he was there, Mr. Lawson turned and asked if he'd finalized his applications yet. Javier nodded and replied that most were done. The teacher didn't ask where. He didn't ask what the responses had been. He simply smiled in that condescending way again and said it was good that Javier was taking practical steps. That night, Javier stared at the acceptance letter again. He opened the email not out of disbelief, but as a way to ground himself. He read the words slowly, as if drawing energy from each one. They had seen him. Not just his test scores, not just his GPA, but the whole picture. The essay he'd written about translating for his mother at doctor appointments since he was 10, about growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 younger siblings and no quiet space to study, about how he'd learned calculus from YouTube videos and borrowed books no one else wanted. Harvard had seen that and said yes. That meant something beyond just prestige. It meant that effort, resilience, and vision had value even when others refused to recognize it. The next day in class, Mr. Lawson returned graded papers with a small note attached to each. Javier's came back with a B+ and a scribbled remark that the essay felt too ambitious in tone. He read it, then folded the paper and slid it into his binder. Ambition, he had learned, scared people, especially when it came from someone they didn't expect it from. He didn't fault Mr. Lawson for doubting him. The man simply couldn't see past his own limited framework. But that framework no longer contained Javier. During lunch, he walked past the honor roll board in the hallway. His name was there, printed neatly among the top-performing seniors. He glanced at it briefly, then moved on. He didn't need walls to tell him who he was anymore. Later that week, the school counselor called him in for a meeting to review his transcripts. She was efficient and kind, her tone clipped but professional. She scanned his file, noted his extracurriculars, and commented on the strength of his application. When she asked if he had heard from any schools yet, Javier nodded and told her about Harvard. At first, she blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Then, her mouth opened slightly as she stared at him. He repeated it calmly. Yes, he had been accepted. Yes, with a full scholarship. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, all the pre-written advice in her folder became irrelevant. She asked to see the email. He showed her. Her expression shifted. Respect, awe, perhaps even disbelief. It all passed over her face in a flash. Then she congratulated him, said she was proud, and promised to notify the administration. Word began to spread slowly. A few teachers mentioned it in passing. Some students heard rumors. Javier remained reserved, confirming when asked, but never announcing it. He didn't need the noise. The truth had its own gravity now, pulling people toward it. Those who had dismissed him began to watch him differently, as if trying to reconcile the version they thought they knew with the one now staring them in the face. But Javier didn't change. He still sat in the back row. Still helped his siblings. Still studied at night with headphones in and dreams sharper than ever. The only difference was that he no longer carried the weight of doubt. He had nothing to prove. The world would catch up eventually. And when it did, he'd be waiting. The spring semester unfolded with an energy that felt both impatient and heavy. Seniors buzzed with anticipation for graduation, the hallway walls plastered with flyers for prom, senior pranks, and college apparel day. For many students, the end was a countdown, a checklist of lasts. The last test, the last cafeteria pizza, the last homeroom bell. But for Javier, each day was a layer, another brick in the foundation he had spent years building quietly. He still woke early, still made breakfast for his siblings, still walked through the same streets where nothing had changed even though he had. The acceptance letter was now printed and framed at home, resting beside a family photo on the kitchen shelf. His mother had done it without asking. She told everyone, and when they didn't believe her, she pulled it from her purse like a badge of honor. Javier didn't stop her. He knew what it meant for her to be able to say those words aloud. At school, the atmosphere around him shifted slowly. Teachers greeted him with more warmth, some even asking about his college plans like they hadn't doubted him just weeks before. His name began to circulate among staff and students alike, not as a curiosity but as an example. Guidance counselors asked if he could speak at an upcoming assembly. His classmates, especially those who had never spoken to him before, started giving him nods of recognition in the hallway, not out of friendship but out of awareness. He was no longer invisible. He had become something else symbolic. It was strange at first, the way people looked at him now, as though he had transcended the usual rules. But he didn't let it distract him. His goals were bigger than momentary validation. Despite the change in tone, Mr. Lawson hadn't said a word. Not one acknowledgement. Not even a passing congratulations. Javier had passed his classroom multiple times, each occasion offering the chance for a nod or gesture, but it never came. It didn't surprise him. Some people clung to their own narratives so tightly that to admit they had been wrong would unravel too much. So Javier didn't seek it. He didn't wait for closure. Instead, he focused on what he could control, finishing strong, preparing for the transition ahead, and continuing to be the person he'd always been. One afternoon, during a school-wide college fair hosted in the gymnasium, Javier was invited to represent first-gen success stories at a panel table. He sat beside two other students, one accepted into Stanford, the other into a full-ride engineering program at a local university. A banner behind them read, "Be the first, but not the last." As students filed past, Javier answered questions about time management, scholarships, and standardized tests. He shared tips he'd learned on his own about writing essays that sounded like him, about cold emailing admissions counselors, about fighting the voice that said he wasn't enough. But more than anything, he watched for the kids in the crowd who stood back, the ones who hovered with uncertain eyes, the ones who looked like he used to feel small, unnoticed, unsure. To them, he gave more than advice. He gave attention. Because he remembered what it felt like to be smart but overlooked, capable but categorized, determined but dismissed. If his presence could chip away at the weight pressing on their shoulders even a little, then the struggle had been worth it. After the event, as students dispersed and faculty reset tables, Javier remained behind for a moment. He looked around the gym, the same space where he'd sat on bleachers during fire drills, where school dances were held under cheap string lights, where basketball games played out to half-full stands. Now, in this very space, he had spoken not just about surviving, but about thriving. About building something without waiting for permission. He left the gym and walked past room 214. The door was open, the lights off. Mr. Lawson sat at his desk alone, grading papers. Javier hesitated just a moment, then moved on. Not out of fear or anger, but because he no longer needed anything from that room. Whatever validation it could have once offered had been replaced by something far deeper. He had seen the horizon for himself now, and no one's opinion could blur it. That evening, Javier returned home to a kitchen filled with noise, his siblings arguing over homework, his mother cooking, the TV playing too loud in the background. He sat at the table, laptop open, working on a draft of his graduation speech. The school had asked him to be one of the speakers. Not because he was class president or the most popular, but because his name meant something now. And he intended to use it wisely. He wrote about beginnings, about the small steps that no one sees but that matter more than any applause. He wrote about failure and how the worst part isn't falling short but being told you were never meant to try. He wrote about resilience, not as a slogan, but as a practice, something earned day after day in silence. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Those who needed to hear it would know. As he saved the file and shut the laptop, he looked out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, cars moved along the highway, and the night pressed against the glass like a quiet promise. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easier. Harvard would challenge him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. There would be new obstacles, new doubts. But he was ready. Not because he was fearless, but because he had already learned how to move forward with fear. In a few months, he would pack his life into a suitcase and board a plane to a place that once felt unreachable. But for now, he was here present, prepared, and steady. The same boy they once underestimated. The same boy they would soon remember. Summer crept in slowly, the school days stretching thinner as the end approached. The air was warmer, the classrooms more restless, and the hallways filled with the kind of energy that only comes when everything familiar is about to change. Seniors began counting down the days with dry erase markers on lockers, crossing off each morning like it was a victory. Final exams loomed, but most of the students were already halfway gone in their minds, dreaming of beaches, road trips, or just freedom from the rigid rhythm of school life. Javier, however, remained grounded. Every day still mattered to him. Not out of fear, but discipline. He understood that consistency wasn't something to drop once the goal was in sight, it was what carried you through to the finish. At home, the atmosphere was a mix of joy and logistics. His mother had begun preparing for graduation weeks in advance, ironing shirts, polishing shoes, and making lists of relatives who would be coming to the ceremony. She worked extra shifts to cover the cost of travel for family members from out of town. His siblings, too young to fully understand the gravity of Harvard, knew it was something huge because everyone around them treated it that way. They drew pictures of Javier at Harvard with crayon versions of ivy-covered walls and cartoon professors. He taped one to the refrigerator, smiling each time he walked past it. The school began collecting cap and gown sizes, distributing yearbooks, and hosting mandatory rehearsals in the gymnasium. Javier sat through them quietly, listening to the principal's directions, watching his classmates joke and whisper between rows of metal chairs. He didn't join in, but he wasn't alone either. A few students who had once ignored him now sought him out with questions about applications or scholarships for their younger siblings. He answered when asked, not out of obligation, but because he understood that silence helps no one when you've already walked the path. One morning, as he arrived early for a student leadership breakfast, he passed by a bulletin board near the main office. Pinned to it was a display titled Class of Future Leaders with photos of selected seniors and the colleges they'd be attending. His face was there now, centered on a line of Ivy League names, the Harvard crest beneath it catching the light. For a moment he stood in front of it alone, his fingers brushing over the paper. It was strange to see himself celebrated in a space where, not long ago, he'd been invisible. Mr. Lawson walked past at that very moment. He paused, took in the display, glanced at Javier, and nodded once before walking away. It wasn't a smile. Not a word. Just a nod. But it lingered. For a second, Javier almost believed it was an apology or at least a concession. Yet it lacked the sincerity of acknowledgement. It felt more like a man recognizing the scoreboard had changed but refusing to admit he'd bet against the wrong team. Graduation grew closer. Javier spent hours finalizing his speech. He wanted it to be honest, not a self-congratulating speech about overcoming odds, but a reflection of the broader truth. That talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. That potential often wears hoodies and second-hand shoes. That sometimes the brightest minds walk through the back doors of this country's institutions because the front ones are barred by assumption. On the day of the final rehearsal, he stood at the podium for the first time. The auditorium was empty except for staff and a few other student speakers. He read his draft aloud, his voice steady but measured. The words landed softly in the open space, echoing slightly. Afterward, one of the assistant principals approached and said it gave her chills. Javier thanked her and returned home that evening feeling both ready and quietly unsettled. Public speaking wasn't what he feared. What he feared was that even this moment, his moment, could be framed through the wrong lens. As luck. As exception. As novelty. But he wasn't a story. He was a result. On the final school day, students roamed the halls saying their goodbyes, signing yearbooks, taking pictures in front of murals and lockers. Javier packed his belongings neatly, turned in his textbooks, and visited the library one last time. He thanked the librarian, who had always greeted him with kindness and let him stay after hours to study. She handed him a note written in cursive on a torn scrap of paper. It read, "The shelves will miss you, but the world won't know what hit it. Go be undeniable." That night, he sat at his kitchen table with his mother, sipping tea in the quiet. They didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. They had made it. Together. He glanced down at the framed acceptance letter again, thinking not about the institution itself, but about the version of himself that once doubted he belonged anywhere outside the four corners of his neighborhood. Javier's mind was already shifting toward what came next: orientation, course selection, flights, living arrangements. He didn't fear the future. Not anymore. He had already been underestimated in every room he'd walked into. And now he knew that no amount of doubt from others could shrink a dream that was already alive inside him. The morning of graduation arrived with a brightness that felt unreal, as if the sun itself understood what this day meant. Javier woke early, not from an alarm but from the hum of energy running beneath his skin. His suit, ironed and neatly hung the night before, waited beside the mirror. His cap and gown lay folded on the back of the chair. Outside, the city was quiet, still caught in the slow stretch of a Saturday morning, but in his small apartment, everything pulsed with motion. His mother moved between the kitchen and the front room, double-checking the camera, ironing her own blouse, making sure his siblings were dressed and clean and ready. They had never attended a ceremony like this before. This wasn't just another school event. This was a turning point for them all. As Javier adjusted his tie in the mirror, he caught a glimpse of himself, not the boy who had once stared at this same reflection in a hand-me-down hoodie, wondering if any of it would be possible, but the young man who had made it real. He didn't feel taller or older. He felt calm, steady, grounded in the knowledge that the world no longer looked the same to him, not because the world had changed, but because he had. He could see through it now, through the smiles and titles and assumptions, through the layers of expectation that had once tried to hold him in place. When they arrived at the school, the parking lot was already full. Families spilled out of cars holding flowers, balloons, and cameras, their excitement bubbling into the early heat. Javier walked alongside his mother and siblings, his cap balanced carefully in his hand, the tassel swinging with each step. Inside, the gym had been transformed. The bleachers were decorated with school colors, the floor lined with folding chairs in precise rows. A makeshift stage rose at the front, framed by banners that read Class of Determination, Class of Resilience, and Class of 2025. Javier took his seat near the front row reserved for student speakers. He held the folded copy of his speech in his lap, not because he needed it, he had memorized every word, but because the weight of it felt familiar and reassuring. The ceremony began with the usual speeches, the principal recounting statistics, a faculty member sharing anecdotes about how far the class had come, the class president thanking parents and staff. Families cheered as names were called, students crossing the stage in a blur of smiles, heels, sneakers, and handshakes. Javier clapped for each one, not out of obligation but because he understood that every name represented more than a student. It represented survival, persistence, often unseen sacrifice. When his name was called, a sudden hush fell over the audience, not because he was unexpected, but because everyone had been waiting for this moment. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It was measured, deliberate, filled with the clarity of someone who had lived every sentence before writing it. He spoke not of triumph, but of process. He described waking before sunrise, walking his siblings to school, borrowing books the school couldn't afford to replace. He spoke of the invisible labor it took to show up every day with a goal that few believed he had a right to chase. He talked about doubt, not just from others but from within, and how he had learned to treat it like background noise rather than a command. And finally, he spoke about the future, not as a dream but as a responsibility. That for every Javier in every school hallway across the country, someone needed to speak first, to break the pattern, to hold the door open a little longer. When he finished, the room erupted. Not in the explosive cheer reserved for sports heroes or homecoming kings, but in something more powerful, a collective pause, a wave of standing ovation that felt like the whole gym had inhaled and released something it didn't know it was holding. Javier stepped away from the podium and rejoined his classmates. He didn't smile for the cameras. He didn't wave to the crowd. He simply sat down, hands folded, and exhaled. After the ceremony, dozens of people came up to him, teachers, students, strangers with damp eyes and firm handshakes. Some told him he had reminded them of someone they knew. Others said he had given them something to hold onto. Mr. Lawson approached too, slower than the others, standing at a polite distance before extending his hand. Javier took it. There were no words. None were needed. The gesture was enough, and Javier accepted it not as an apology but as a moment of growth for them both. Back at home, the celebration was small but perfect. His mother cooked her best dishes and neighbors dropped by with warm embraces and folded cards. Javier sat on the couch, his siblings sprawled across the floor, balloons floating against the ceiling, his framed Harvard letter displayed beside the TV. He looked around and saw not a party but a ceremony of another kind, a family bearing witness to change. Not through speeches or certificates, but through presence, food, laughter, and love. Later that night, long after the guests had left and the kitchen had been cleaned, Javier stepped out onto the small balcony. The city stretched before him, glittering under the weight of its own endless stories. He stood quietly, feeling the breeze press against his shirt, carrying the scent of summer and street food and opportunity. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for the next chapter: housing forms, travel logistics, orientation packets. But tonight he allowed himself to be still. He closed his eyes and thought about the teacher who laughed, the classmates who never asked, the counselors who steered him towards safety. He didn't feel bitterness. He felt purpose. Because everything they had overlooked had only sharpened him. Everything they tried to limit had taught him where the ceiling actually was and how to break through it. And now, standing beneath a sky that felt wide enough to finally hold him, Javier understood something simple and permanent. He was never supposed to fit in. He was meant to lead. Javier stepped off the train platform at South Station with a single worn-out suitcase, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and a folder containing his admission documents pressed tightly under his arm. The Boston air was cooler than he expected, crisp and unfamiliar, filled with the kind of rush that only big cities could generate. The buildings loomed with historic grace, and the crowds moved quickly as if no one had time to look up, yet everything around him demanded to be seen. He stood there for a moment, rooted not by hesitation but by a quiet awe. He had arrived. Not just in a geographical sense, but in the deeper way that dreams, once laughed at, quietly become reality. Harvard's campus revealed itself slowly over the next few days. He wandered through its courtyards, tracing the age-worn paths lined with red brick and shaded by ancient trees. There was history in every corner, echoes of voices and footsteps that had shaped worlds beyond this one. And now his footsteps joined them. He attended orientation meetings where professors explained syllabi with rapid precision and classmates introduced themselves with names that sounded like legacies, sons and daughters of diplomats, scientists, authors, entrepreneurs. They talked about boarding schools in Switzerland, summer programs in Shanghai, and nonprofit internships in Kenya. Javier nodded and listened, absorbing everything, storing away details like he always had. But he also noticed something else. They didn't intimidate him. He didn't feel lesser. He didn't feel lucky. He felt earned. Because while they had polished resumes and family networks, he carried resilience and discipline forged in rooms where the lights flickered and the air smelled of bleach and rice. He had read textbooks with torn pages, studied while rocking a crib with one foot, and walked into classrooms where teachers never looked up when he entered. And yet here he was. Not by accident. Not by charity. But by right. Classes began, and with them came the pressure. Readings stacked high, discussions that moved quickly, professors who challenged every assumption. At first, Javier kept to himself, observing the dynamics, learning the unspoken rules. He spent long hours in the library, sometimes arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the last desk lamp flickered off. His classmates often looked surprised when he raised his hand, surprised again when his comments cut through the noise with clarity. Some learned his name quickly. Others still called him "Hey man" or "You in the back." He didn't correct them. He simply kept showing up. The weight of Harvard wasn't just academic, it was cultural. And he bore it the way he always had, not with noise, but with consistency. Outside the classroom, he found work-study tutoring sessions, part-time shifts in the campus mailroom, and quiet moments writing essays under the vaulted ceilings of Widener Library. His world had expanded, but his core remained the same. He still called his mother every Sunday. He still sent money home when he could. And he still remembered exactly what it felt like to hear a teacher laugh at the idea of someone like him going to college. That memory, once heavy, had become a tool, a reminder. One afternoon, during an office hour with a professor who had noticed his writing, he was invited to join a research group. The professor said his analysis was sharp, his voice necessary. Javier accepted, not with surprise, but with the steady acknowledgement that he belonged in rooms where voices shaped narratives. not just received them. In that seminar room filled with upperclassmen and graduate students, Javier offered insight rooted not in theory but in lived experience. And slowly the room shifted. People listened. They quoted him. They asked for his thoughts. Months passed. Midterms came and went. He earned his grades not with ease, but with intention. He stayed up late, rewrote papers 3 times, sought feedback, asked hard questions. He didn't want to survive at Harvard. He wanted to transform within it. He wanted to extract everything the institution offered, not as a gift, but as compensation for all the spaces that had tried to keep him small. By spring, Javier stood in front of a group of local high school students visiting the campus as part of an outreach program. He wasn't scheduled to speak, but when the student coordinator asked for volunteers, he stepped forward. He told them about his city, about growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment with 5 people and no privacy, about the school counselor who never asked about his dreams, about the night he opened his acceptance letter under a flickering streetlight. He didn't embellish. He didn't perform. He just told the truth. And in the silence that followed, he saw himself in their eyes. Not the version of himself Harvard had accepted, but the version still forming, still doubting, still wondering if any of this was possible. He told them it was. Not because he was exceptional, but because he was prepared. Because he had decided that his voice mattered before anyone else did. That night, walking back to his dorm through the quiet, lamplit campus, Javier thought about legacy. Not the kind written into buildings or carved into stone, but the kind carried in choices, in how you show up, in who you bring with you. His name would never be etched into the side of a library, but it would live in classrooms he reshaped, in students he encouraged, in systems he refused to accept as fixed. He had been told once that Harvard was not for people like him. But standing there, wind pressing against his coat, city lights blinking in the distance beyond the Charles River, he knew better. Harvard was for the relentless, for the thoughtful, for those who came with questions, not answers. He didn't need to prove he belonged anymore. He was already building a place for others to follow. And when they arrived, they wouldn't need permission to stay. They would see someone like them already there and know the truth. There was never a ceiling, only silence waiting to be broken.